In August of 1974, Linda Taylor was arrested in Chicago for welfare fraud charges in Michigan. Taylor initially fled bond and became a media sensation. The Chicago Tribune dropped a report on Taylor's fraud. The story got national attention when, during the 1976 presidential campaign, Ronald Reagan used her story, embellishing so far as to suggest that Taylor had stolen up to $1 million from the U.S. federal welfare system. Taylor was only ever charged with stealing up to $9,000 at the time. But Reagan knew what he was doing by using the Taylor story as a rallying cry for welfare reform. The 60s and 70s were dotted with stories of abuse in the welfare system, and the impact of the 1970s stagflation on urban centers like New York City gave conservative fiscal hawks a victim blaming narrative to explain away decay in black communities. To them, it was obvious that an overly generous welfare system was catering to the laziness inherent in African Americans, a theme as old as American slavery. They just needed a way to say it without being explicit, racism without racists. The welfare queen trope was perfect. It had a familiar anecdote in Linda Taylor, and her dual identity of being a black woman played on two violations of Protestant American values: hypersexuality. Women were and still are often accused of having children out of wedlock to collect larger welfare benefits, and laziness. Was any of this true about black women like Linda Taylor? Well, first, African Americans may be overrepresented among the poor, but they're not the majority of welfare recipients. Studies of the time demonstrate that African Americans were overrepresented in media depictions of welfare recipients, accounting for 3/4 of representations, although blacks made up only a third of welfare recipients. Additionally, there's no evidence to suggest that women systematically were having children out of wedlock to qualify for higher welfare benefits. But wait, if Taylor's story really wasn't emblematic of anything, why did it and the welfare queen trope have so much of an impact on the thinking around welfare reform for the next 2 decades? Likely because discrimination and bias is a pillar of American society. Discrimination occurs when people with similar economic characteristics experience different economic outcomes, and often those outcomes can be stratified by race, gender, or other non economic traits. Often that discrimination occurs because of biases, which can be explicit, such as when someone actively believes that black women are meeting their hypersexual and lazy desires by relying upon a welfare system that benefits recipients with more children. They can also be implicit, as has been seen in studies where participants watch children and those who are first prompted to look out for misbehaving children spend more time monitoring the black children than their counterparts. The fact is that studies like these have found evidence of implicit racial biases among people of various backgrounds, including anti black biases among blacks. It may be shameful, but it's likely that all of us retain some implicit biases to some extent, which allows for discrimination to occur in the US regardless of statistical facts. As Americans, the welfare queen trope didn't make us biased against low income black women. It played on the biases we already had. One of the most fascinating and important arenas to observe biases in action is in the labor market. A University of Chicago Nobel Prize winning researcher named Gary Becker was one of the first mainstream economists to attempt to model discrimination in the labor market, arguing that discrimination may stem from preferences similar to what is analyzed in consumer behavior. In Becker's model, people have tastes for working with certain races and rationally take efforts to create segregation. This could lead to a labor market with different demand curves based on race, with less non-white workers demanded at the same wage level. There are two really important things to note from Becker's model. First, it implies a costly level of inefficiency for firms that have to hire white workers at a higher market rate than would have been the case without discrimination. Some firms may rationally choose to do this if they have reason to believe customers will reward them by consuming more of the services, or that workers in the firm will be more productive if they also prefer segregation. Second, and less focused upon, is that equity is in some ways a zero-sum game. It requires sacrifices from the preferenced group. If white workers are inefficiently being hired at an elevated market wage, and therefore black workers are being hired at a lower market wage, then equity in the labor market will look like higher wages for black workers and lower wages for white workers. This is important because while most Americans arguably desire some abstract vision of equality, fewer are likely willing to sacrifice their resources, privileges, to attain that equality. Becker's model of labor market discrimination can be applied to a lot of stratifications. Studies suggest being a woman, overweight, or physically unattractive can also put you at a disadvantage in searching for a job. Anecdotal evidence suggests that gender expression, sexuality, and disability status have also impeded employment. Following civil and violent unrest in the 1960s and the assassinations of prominent civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King, Medgar Evers, and Malcolm X, the U.S. passed a slew of laws aimed at establishing civil rights for minorities and preventing discrimination. Since then, the wage gap between minority groups has closed substantially, although little has happened to the wage gap between minorities in the aggregate and white men. In a weird way, this explains why the welfare queen stereotype was so appealing for Reagan, competing for the Republican nomination in 1976. The Southern strategy employed by the Republican Party banked on the fears of African Americans gaining political power and using that power to strip the public coffers of taxpayer dollars while degrading the real economic privileges that came from whiteness in America. The Civil Rights Act and other laws aimed at suppressing discrimination and embracing equality struck a chord, and the GOP was more than ready to play on deeply buried fears with the image of a black woman collecting welfare checks and making more soon-to-be voters. The laws that came out of the Civil Rights era also birthed an institutionalized approach to affirmative action. While various programs can fall under the umbrella of affirmative action, many have faced backlash from various overrepresented groups, especially in regards to college admission. And while evidence suggests that these programs have had positive impacts on blacks and whites, other evidence suggests affirmative action has been more beneficial to middle-class African Americans than lower-income ones. It would be an error, though, to overlook how far public policy has come since Reagan first injected the welfare queen stereotype into the political dialogue. But a sober analysis can also only conclude that as helpful as civil rights laws have been, they only did so much to change the pre-market conditions that shape outcomes for minorities nationally. For example, on a more micro scale, take New York City. In 2020, we're still one of the most highly racially segregated cities in the nation. The effects of redlining still run through our elementary and high schools, creating unequal outcomes based on neighborhoods that proxy concentrations of poverty and racial makeup. Discrimination will always be a problem for Americans until we get to the point that your childhood zip code isn't a predictor of your midlife income.